Everyone keeps bringing up affordability these days. It's turned into the defining word for a whole generation of people aged roughly 20 to 40 who feel absolutely overwhelmed and crushed by contemporary economic pressures. These individuals watch their aspirations crumble because they can't gather enough funds to purchase a home, can't manage the expense of taking their loved ones on a proper vacation, and certainly can't cope with the rapidly increasing prices of essential health care. This entire situation connects deeply to fundamental questions about our economic system's actual functioning and who truly controls it. But this is where things become totally wild and honestly somewhat absurd. The reasoning from the left and Democratic establishment gets so convoluted and reversed that it's dizzying just attempting to understand their logic. Let me lay out their position so you can recognize how absurd it truly is. Throughout 4 continuous years under their administration, we endured severe hyperinflation that decimated working families and wiped out savings. We're discussing inflation reaching a catastrophic 9.1% in 2022. Even calculating the average across those difficult years, it remained far above 5% throughout. These aren't merely statistics on paper. These are actual people witnessing their earnings lose value and their food expenses seemingly double in an instant. But now hear this distorted logic they're promoting. They genuinely possess the nerve to pivot and criticize Donald Trump for maintaining inflation rates between 2.6 and 2.7% throughout his initial 10 months returning to office. Consider how irrational that criticism actually is. They're genuinely attacking him for not immediately resolving the catastrophe they generated through their irresponsible spending and poor policies. They're claiming he bears accountability because he didn't miraculously eliminate their errors quickly enough to satisfy them. Their entire approach appears centered on this reversed logic. They intend to block him in Congress at every opportunity. And they're already organizing their return campaign for 2028, built on the premise that their policies, which triggered the hyperinflation initially, should receive another opportunity because Trump hasn't reduced prices to earlier levels fast enough. They're basically insisting that he should have reached not merely moderate inflation or even minimal inflation, but actually zero inflation right away, something they never managed themselves. The absolute gall of this tactic is astounding when you truly consider it. They damage something severely, observe it, collapse, then criticize the following person for not repairing their disaster immediately, while concurrently attempting to stop him from executing solutions. That's their complete strategy currently. And they're betting on people failing to recognize this deceptive game they're conducting with economic accountability. But there's another vital aspect to this scenario that requires our focus and comprehension. The Trump economy currently is participating in what I'd characterize as a high-stakes competition against the clock. It's a competition with extremely significant ramifications because there's merely 1 year left before the crucial test of the midterm elections happens. These approaching midterms will be fundamentally distinct from standard midterm elections we've witnessed previously. And the explanation is straightforward. The Democratic Party has evolved into something utterly unrecognizable from its former self. This isn't the Democratic Party of previous generations anymore, not remotely. What we're observing now is basically a radical Jacobin-style neo-socialist faction that has captured control of the party structure and is pushing it toward extreme stances that would have been inconceivable merely 10 years earlier. The consequences couldn't be more serious because if Donald Trump surrenders control of the House of Representatives during these midterms, the outcomes will be swift and harsh. Within actually 1 week, perhaps even sooner, he'll confront impeachment procedures. That's not conjecture or alarmism. That's an absolute certainty based on everything they've expressed and executed. Those impeachment proceedings won't be brief either. They'll extend for weeks, continuing into months, controlling news coverage and absorbing government focus. They'll make the recent government shutdown appear like trivial amusement by comparison, just a slight annoyance. The complete agenda will become disrupted. Advancement will stop completely, and disorder will dominate. So the urgent question becomes, how does he avoid this catastrophic situation from materializing? Well, luckily, the groundwork is actually quite stable when you examine the actual data instead of the media distortion. We presently have a reasonably robust and sound economy, despite what the pessimists forecasted. Inflation is floating between 2.6 and 2.9%, which is controllable and nowhere close to the emergency levels we experienced before. It'll likely average approximately 3% for the complete year when we compute everything, though we won't have the final figures for some time. Gross domestic product growth is anticipated to reach around 3% for the year, which represents solid expansion in economic vitality. Although, notably, the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank has indicated it might potentially climb as high as 4%, which would be absolutely wonderful news for everyone. The stock market continues reaching all-time record peaks, which means retirement funds are expanding and investor assurance remains powerful. Remember all that media frenzy and alarm we were subjected to throughout the spring period? They informed us with complete conviction that the economy was moving toward total collapse. They forecasted complete catastrophe and described apocalyptic situations. Well, what happened? They were entirely and completely incorrect about everything. We didn't undergo a destructive tariff trade war that demolished the international commercial framework like they shouted about constantly. We didn't observe a disastrous trade war with China that destroyed the economic connections between our countries. We didn't experience a stock market crash that eliminated trillions in value. Actually, as I referenced, the reverse occurred with markets achieving record heights. We didn't descend into a recession despite numerous economists and media personalities claiming it was certain and approaching. Every single catastrophe forecast proved to be incorrect, deceptive, or intentionally amplified for political objectives. So, what does the Trump administration absolutely have to achieve during this vital competition against the midterm deadline? There are multiple critical goals. Perhaps three primary things that must occur to guarantee victory and avoid disaster. First, and most importantly, the administration must continuously remind the American public that the economic performance achieved within merely the first 10 months is vastly and significantly better in practically every quantifiable measure compared to what transpired during the 4 lengthy years under Biden's direction. The difference is dramatic when you review the facts truthfully. You produce an extra 1 million barrels of oil in just 10 months, and abruptly the cost of gasoline decreases substantially. Last week, the average cost per gallon was $2.98. Contrast that to the average of $3.46 under Biden's policies. That's a magnificent and outstanding accomplishment, reducing gas prices by almost 50 cents per gallon, which represents actual money returned to people's wallets every time they refuel their vehicles. But here's the aggravating aspect. That amazing achievement isn't receiving appropriate coverage or recognition in the mainstream media because it doesn't match their favored story. The following essential responsibility involves reminding everyone that the left is actively and purposefully conducting a coordinated campaign to halt progress in this economic competition. Their objective is transparent. They want to stall this economy before the midterms happen so they can assert things aren't functioning. How precisely are they implementing this obstruction approach? They're accomplishing it by organizing the longest government shutdown in American history. The entire thing was completely illogical when you analyze what the Democrats actually executed and why. I mean, seriously, they had supported repeatedly previously for continuing resolutions without reluctance. And Barack Obama himself had presented passionate addresses about the immorality and basic wrongness of shutting down the government, describing it as nearly unlawful to utilize shutdowns as political instruments simply because you lost elections and didn't command the House majority. Then there's the complete Obamacare subsidy situation. To examine, when Obamacare got forced through in 2010, we were constantly assured it wouldn't require subsidies and would be self-sufficient through market mechanisms. Almost right after implementation, those commitments were revealed as untrue. It was shown to be precisely what opponents had warned all along. A failed concept requiring enormous multi-billion-dollar subsidies just to continue operating. The Democrats succeeded in getting those subsidies authorized, but they incorporated a sunset provision stating the subsidies would ultimately terminate once Obamacare supposedly became more market-oriented and productive. That change never materialized, not even remotely. So for all those explanations and additional ones, they shut down the government and generated disorder. But let's be totally frank here. That wasn't the genuine reason behind their behavior. The real purpose, if you're being honest, wasn't about causing immediate disorder with government employees in Virginia during recent elections, though that was definitely a benefit for them. More significantly and tactically, it was constructed specifically to decelerate the economy and create resistance on growth. The identical thing applies to Jerome Powell and the Federal Reserve's decisions. For reasons that appear politically driven rather than economically justified, members of the Fed who establish interest rate policy seem reluctant to reduce rates so that regular Americans could secure 30-year mortgages or 15-year mortgages at sensible 4 to 5% rates and genuinely afford to purchase homes. I truly don't comprehend why this opposition exists unless it's political. But the trend is clear and genuine. There are simply no credible signs that we're currently in a hyperinflationary climate like what we experienced during the Biden years. Inflation is positioned at acceptable levels. Economic growth is positive without being so vigorous that it generates uncontrolled inflation. There are even some encouraging signs with tariff revenue gathering and DOGE spending reductions demonstrating that budget deficits are finally being addressed appropriately instead of expanding uncontrollably. They're not increasing anymore, which is enormously important. So, there exists completely no legitimate economic justification not to handle interest rates and lower them to assist families. Yet, Donald Trump discovers himself battling struggles on numerous fronts at once. He's battling against the Federal Reserve's persistent opposition. He's battling the economic harm from the lockdown approach. And he's battling this continuous media story asserting he generated hyperinflation and that we're moving unavoidably toward recession. What does he need to accomplish to prevail in these struggles? It's actually quite simple and clear when you consider the next year tactically. Trump must plainly and consistently express this straightforward comparison. This was what the Biden record appeared like for 4 agonizing years. This is what I have completed in just 2 years of effort. This was the horrible disaster Biden abandoned for me to repair. And this is precisely what I'm going to execute moving forward to make things even superior. He needs to emphasize that message repeatedly until it penetrates the media barrier. Then ultimately, he has to successfully convey and communicate that many of his policy programs are structured for long-term change rather than immediate solutions. They're not intended to display results instantly. They're constructing foundations for maintained prosperity. By that I mean he's tremendously enlarging federal land leases for energy development. He's forcefully deregulating the Departments of Interior and Energy, removing bureaucratic obstacles that choke development. We've already observed oil production grow by 1 million barrels during just 10 months, but forecasts indicate we'll probably witness increases of 2 or even 3 million extra barrels. That's going to have a profound and considerable impact on energy costs by pushing them notably lower for consumers and enterprises. He's also advocating strongly for increased natural gas utilization in electrical generation and encouraging construction of many new nuclear power facilities for clean, dependable baseload power. What we're certainly not going to do anymore is squander taxpayer funds subsidizing ineffective and exceptionally expensive wind and solar ventures like we unwisely did previously. That modification in energy policy alone will have quantifiable, beneficial impacts on electricity expenses. We have never effectively deported, in our complete history, 2 million people, either through direct pressure or promoting self-deportation. We achieved exactly that this year, and we're on course to equal or surpass those figures next year. That will eventually mean 3 to 4 to possibly 5 million people who are no longer draining taxpayer resources through social welfare systems that prove extraordinarily expensive at state, local, and federal levels. Furthermore, they will not be occupying jobs away from American citizens who need work. You'll effectively have 4 or 5 million people extracted from the workforce who honestly should never have been in that workforce unlawfully to start with. That transformation will have enormous beneficial impacts on the economy, job accessibility, and wage increases for citizens. There are thrilling new technologies developing quickly that will revolutionize our economic environment. artificial intelligence, sophisticated robotics, genetic engineering advances, and, as I referenced, multiple new nuclear facilities becoming operational. All of these revolutionary technologies have been authorized and expedited for implementation. Silicon Valley business leaders and innovators are totally committed to these programs and contributing substantially. These technologies will begin activating and displaying actual outcomes soon. If even 1/3 of Donald Trump's $15 trillion in committed foreign investment gets confirmed and converted into actual ventures and operations, that alone will begin having tremendous long-term beneficial impacts on employment and expansion. The tariffs have already generated $400 billion in revenue, with forecasts indicating maybe $400 to $500 billion total. Contrast that to the final year of the Biden administration, when tariff revenue was merely $77 billion. If Donald Trump takes that $400 billion in tariff funds and intelligently dedicates it directly to lowering the deficit rather than just distributing checks for $2,000 to 200 million people, then that will have a significant and substantial impact on financial markets, Wall Street assurance, and bond markets. Investors will recognize clearly that the president is earnestly using $400 billion of tariff revenue to authentically decrease the deficit and prevent the concerning ratio of federal debt toward gross domestic product from rising. That fiscal accountability will prove very comforting to investors and fortify the dollar. Bottom line, and this is essential to grasp, Donald Trump is participating in a competition against time to communicate his message successfully. He needs Americans to recognize that the economy is already considerably superior than the Biden economy was on virtually every indicator. It's going to become substantially better as policies take complete effect. And people completely must not accept the media stories, because the media, just like the Democratic shutdown and the Federal Reserve's manufactured attempts to maintain interest rates elevated, are politically driven rather than accurate. But if everything proceeds the way that he has meticulously organized, and if he continues executing the correct things at the correct moments, then right around midterm election time, the economy is going to advance remarkably and justify his complete approach to economic policy and leadership.